War II has convinced Americans, particularly the government, that the scientists can save us. It was technology that largely played the decisive role in World War II, and it appears to be technology that will play the decisive role going forward. In 1961, for example, Time magazine names the American scientist, not a particular one, but just the American scientist generally, as the Man of the Year. Incidentally, 1961 is also the year that Marvel Comics begins publishing superhero comics. The first one being the Fantastic Four. And the Fantastic Four is very much a Cold War story, and it also reflects this idea of the scientist as hero. Reed Richards, of course, the stretchy guy, Mr. Fantastic, is a brilliant scientist who's developed a spaceship, and he sneaks the spaceship out and takes it up early because he's trying to beat the Russians into space. Again, who's the hero? A scientist, and what are we trying to do? Beat the Russians. Shortly after that, we see characters like Henry Pym, another super brilliant scientist. He develops the technology to make himself shrink and grow. The Hulk, of course, is a scientist as well. Bruce Banner, well, he's not, but his alter ego is, who is turned into the Hulk, incidentally, by a bomb, gamma bomb, radiation. Iron Man, Tony Stark, another scientific genius, a weapons developer. It's hard to imagine today making a weapons developer a hero, but of course Stark was fighting the communists with those weapons, so he was a hero. And Peter Parker, of course, he's only a teenager, but he's a scientific genius of a teenager. And incidentally, we have also that radioactive theme there, as a radioactive spider gives him his power. It is not normal, historically, when you are creating heroes to use scientists as your starting point. This is a uniquely Cold War, uniquely early 1960s mindset where perhaps the majority of the early Marvel heroes are scientists who become superheroes. And that reflects this importance. The 20th century advanced medicine than all of human history had before. Most of this was done after World War II. Antibiotics, which are probably the most important discovery in medicine, maybe ever, definitely near the top, are made during this time. The idea that we can take medicine that strengthens our body's ability to fight infections. Louis Pasteur and Joubert had discovered antibodies in France in the 1870s, but it will not be until the 20th century that we figure out how to use them effectively to fight disease. Joseph Lister had pioneered antiseptic, but in the and this is becoming common practice now. The idea that you have to sterilize your instrument to kill germs, which is greatly going to improve surgery and survival rates in hospitals and that sort of thing. During the 1930s, the Europeans developed sulfas, which are medicines that combat staph and strep infections, which are major causes of death at the time, by the way. In 1928, Alexander Fleming, a British scientist, had accidentally made penicillin and then discovered that it was an extremely powerful antibiotic. Florey and Chain at Oxford produced a stable version of the drug, and it worked in its first trials in 1941. But unfortunately, we didn't mass produce it until after World War II, setting it aside for war production. But after World War II, American labs will begin to mass produce penicillin, and it will become the first kind of wonder drug antibiotic. Now we've specialized antibiotics, so where we have different antibiotics to treat almost every disease you might come down with. Immunizations are another thing that becomes common. These started with the Puritans. Jenner in Britain had vaccinated, had limited success vaccinating for smallpox, but it really won't be the American Puritans until the American Puritans where this begins to become common practice. Almworth Wright, another British scientist, vaccinated typhoid in 1897. And we develop a tetanus vaccine that shows up before World War II. Tuberculosis is vaccinated in the 1920s. And these diseases, which used to be very common and kill lots and lots of people, essentially go away. I mean, we rarely hear about these diseases anymore because of vaccinations. Of course, viruses are much harder to vaccinate against. But in the 1930s, we learned how to grow viruses in labs so that we could study them and began to develop vaccines for them. The yellow fever vaccine is invented in the 1930s, and the flu vaccine, which as we all know isn't perfect, was invented in 1945. In 1954, Jonas Salk will invent a vaccine for polio, a major crippler of children and killer of children. And Truman will attempt to distribute polio vaccines free to every child in the country. Unfortunately, conservative Republicans will claim that that would be communism, and so they force people to pay for it. And so if you don't have enough money to get your kid a polio vaccine, he remains at risk. By 1960, a man named Sabin has developed an oral vaccine, and polio was wiped out in the 1960s. Mortality declines at every age, and life expectancy generally in America rises from 65 to 71 years of age. We also figure out to use pesticides to protect crops, particularly to wipe out disease-carrying insects. We began using DDT in 1939 to kill bugs, and the Army uses it in huge amounts all across the Pacific in 1942. The idea to get rid of the mosquitoes and other bugs that are spreading things like malaria. We use it liberally in Italy in 1943 and 1944 to stop malarial outbreaks, and we saved thousands of lives. Unfortunately, it won't be until the 1960s that we realize that it has long-term effects, particularly damaging the genetics of both humans and animals, damaging them at the DNA level, but we'll talk about that when we get to the 60s. By the 1940s, we've developed the first commercial television and the technology to broadcast television signals. Color TV becomes available in the early 1960s. In 1948, Bell Labs, or AT&T, invents a transistor which replaces the vacuum tube and begins the wave of miniaturization. Earlier electronics had run on the vacuum tube, but new electronics will run on transistors. The vacuum tube's there on the left, transistors on the right. By the way, if you read old Iron Man comic books, all he always talks about is transistors, because at the time they were cutting-edge technology, but now it seems kind of funny. All this would also lead to the integrated circuit, which combined a number of previously large components into a single piece using microscopic components, which would lead to far more advanced machines and ultimately lay the groundwork for computers. Computers had previously really only been used for military applications. They broke codes, they figured out firing solutions for artillery and that sort of thing. But in the 1950s, computers will go commercial. UNIVAC, the Universal Automatic Computer, was built to handle the 1950 census. It could handle both alphabetical and numeric information, and it used a tape storage system. Remington Rand wanted to sell it to private corporations for business purposes, and they had a big publicity stunt on CBS where they predicted, using the computer, the results of the 1952 election. They were relatively accurate, and this really dramatically impressed people at the time. It was the first time most Americans had ever heard the word or understood the concept of a computer. They had been being developed slowly now for a couple of decades, but the average American had never heard this before. Rand failed to sell computers, but a competitor, IBM, stepped into the gap and had success selling computers to businesses. IBM poured an enormous amount of money into research and development and would be the world's leading manufacturer and developer of computers for decades.